Chapter 3, Edmund and the Wardrobe. Lucy ran out of the empty room into the passage and found the other three. "It's all right," she repeated. "I've come back." "What on earth are you talking about, Lucy?" asked Susan. "Why," said Lucy in amazement, "haven't you been wondering where I was?" "So you've been hiding, have you?" said Peter. "Poor old Lou, hiding and nobody noticed. You'll have to hide longer than that if you want people to start looking for you." "But I've been away for hours and hours," said Lucy. The others all stared at one another. "Batty," said Edmund, tapping his head. "Quite batty." "What do you mean, Lou?" said Peter. "Of what I said," answered Lucy. "It was just after breakfast when I went into the wardrobe, and I've been away for hours and hours and had tea, and all sorts of things have happened." "Don't be silly, Lucy," said Susan. "We've only just come out of that room a moment ago, and you were there then." "She's not being silly at all," said Peter. "She's just making up a story for fun. Aren't you, Lou? And why shouldn't she?" "No, Peter, I'm not," she said. It's a magic wardrobe. There's a wood inside it, and it's snowing, and there's a faun and a witch, and it's called Narnia. Come and see." The others did not know what to think, but Lucy was so excited they all went back with her in the room. She rushed ahead of them, flung open the door of the wardrobe, and cried, "Now go in and see for yourselves." "Why, you goose," said Lucy, putting her head inside and pulling the fur coats apart. "It's just an ordinary wardrobe. Look, here's the back of it." Then everyone looked in and pulled the coats apart, and they all saw, Lucy herself saw, a perfectly ordinary wardrobe. There was no wood, no snow, and only the back of the wardrobe with hooks on it. Peter went in and rapped his knuckles to make sure that it was solid. "A jolly good hoax, Lou," he said, coming out again. "You really did take us in, I must admit. We half believed you." "But it wasn't a hoax at all," said Lucy. "Really and truly, it was all different a moment ago. Honestly, it was, I promise." "Come, Lou," said Peter. "That's gone a bit far. You've had your joke. You better drop it now." Lucy was very red in the face and tried to say something, though she hardly knew what she was trying to say, and then burst into tears. For the next few days, she was very miserable. She could have made up with the others quite easily at any moment if she could have brought herself to say the whole thing was only a story made up for fun. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she was really right. And she couldn't bring herself to say this. The others, who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The two elder ones did this without meaning to do it, but Edmund could be spiteful, and on occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy and kept on asking her if she'd found any other new countries and other cupboards all over the house. What made it worse was that these days ought to have been delightful. The weather was fine and they were out of doors from morning to night, bathing, fishing, climbing, lying in the heather, but Lucy could not properly enjoy any of it. And so things went on until the next wet day. I want to tell you two things about this. First of all, when it says they went bathing, what they really mean is they went swimming. They used to call that bathing, and the suits they had would have arms in them that were long sleeved, and they would have like shorts built into them. So they didn't want to show off too much of their body. The other thing was, there was a time once when my sister had done something wrong. And my aunt, who was the principal of our high school, or our elementary school, said, "If one of you doesn't tell me who did this, by the end of the day, you will not be able to have any tickets for the Halloween carnival tonight," which was a really big deal. It was like everybody went in their costumes and there were booths all over and you bought tickets and you could do anything at any of the booths. And it was so much fun. So I waited a long time, and all day I was just beside myself because I knew I hadn't done it, but I also knew Louise would never cop to it. So finally I decided there's no point in both of us missing out. So I went to my aunt and I said, "Can I see you?" And she was still in her principal's office. And so she called me in And she said, "What is it?" And I said, "I did it. Whatever it is, I did it." She said, "I know you're lying. So no, and now you don't get any tickets either." And I thought, if she knew I was lying, why wouldn't she just say that up front if she knew Louise had done it? Because there were only two of us. I still wonder why she did that. But I remember we never got tickets because one of the things your aunt did was she always honored her word. And if she said no tickets, there weren't going to be any tickets. I also remember my mother coming to her and saying, "Do you think maybe you might be being a little tough on her?" But you know what I noticed? Integrity is important, and you should always tell the truth, even when, like Lucy, nobody really wants to hear it. So things went on until the next wet day. That day, when it came to the afternoon and there was still no sign of a break in the weather, she decided to play hide and seek. Susan was it. And as soon as the others scattered to hide, Lucy went to the room where the wardrobe was. She didn't mean to hide in the wardrobe because she knew they would only set the others talking about that whole wretched business, but she did want to have one more look inside of it, for by this time she was beginning to wonder herself whether Narnia and the Fawn had been a dream. The house was so large and complicated and full of hiding places that she thought she would have time to have one look into the wardrobe and then hide somewhere else. But as soon as she reached it, she heard steps in the passage outside, and then there was nothing for it but to jump into the wardrobe and hold the door closed behind her. She didn't shut it properly because she knew that it's very silly to shut oneself in a wardrobe, even if it's not a magic one. Now the steps she heard were those of Edmund, and he came into the room just in time to see Lucy vanishing into the wardrobe. He decided at once to get in it himself, not because he thought it particularly a good place to hide, but because he wanted to go on teasing her about her imaginary country. Then he opened the door. There were so many coats hanging up as usual, and the smell of mothballs and darkness and silence and no sign of Lucy. "She thinks I'm Susan come to catch her," said Edmund to himself, "so she's keeping quiet at the back." He jumped in and shut the door, forgetting what a very foolish thing it is to do. Then he began feeling about for Lucy in the dark. He had expected to find her in a few seconds and was very surprised when he did not. And very surprised that he did not. So he decided to open the door again and let in some light, but he couldn't find the door either. He didn't like this at all, and he began groping wildly in every direction. He even shouted out, "Lucy, Lou, where are you? I know you're here." There was no answer, and Edmund noticed that his own voice had a curious sound. Not the sound you expect in a cupboard, but kind of an open air sound. He also noticed that he was unexpectedly cold, and then he saw a light. "Thank goodness," said Edmund. "The door must have swung open of its own accord." He forgot all about Lucy and went toward the light, which he thought was an open door of a wardrobe, but instead of finding himself stepping out into the spare room, he found himself stepping into the shadow of some thick, dark fir trees, into an open place in the middle of a wood. There was crisp, dry snow under his feet and more snow lying on the branches of the trees. Overhead, there was a pale blue sky, the sort of sky one sees on a fine winter day in the morning. Straight ahead of him, he saw, between the tree trunks, the sun just rising, very red and clear. Everything was perfectly still. As if he were the only living creature in that country. There was not even a robin or a squirrel among the trees. The wood stretched as far as he could see in every direction. He shivered. He now remembered that he'd been looking for Lucy, and also how unpleasant he had been to her about her imaginary country, which now turned out not to have been so imaginary after all. He thought She must be somewhere quite close, so we shouted, "Lucy, Lucy, I'm here too, Edmund." There was no answer. She's angry about all the things I've been saying lately, thought Edmund. And though he did not like to admit that he had been wrong, he also didn't much like being alone in this strange, cold, quiet place, so he shouted again. "I say, Lou, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I see now that you were right all along. Do come out and make it Pax." Pax is Latin for peace. And back in those days, you learned Latin in school. Still, there was no answer. "Just like a girl," said Edmund to himself, "sulking somewhere and won't accept the apology." He looked around him again and decided he didn't much like this place. He had almost made up his mind to go home when he heard very far off in the woods the sound of bells. He listened, and the sound came nearer and nearer, and at last there swept into sight a sledge drawn by 2 reindeer. The reindeer were about the size of Shetland ponies. Shetland ponies are ornery, mean little things that look cute like horses, but they're not as nice. And their hair was so white that even the snow hardly looked white compared to them. Their branching horns were gilded and shone like something on fire when the sunlight caught them. Their harnesses were of scarlet leather and covered with bells. On the sledge, driving the reindeer, sat a fat dwarf who would have been about 3 feet high if he'd been standing. He was dressed in polar bear fur, and on his head, he wore a red hood with long gold tassel hanging down from its point. His huge beard covered his knees and served him instead of a rug, but behind him, on a much higher seat, in the middle of the sledge, sat a very different person, a great lady, taller than any woman Edmund had ever seen. She also was covered in white fur up to her throat that held a long, straight golden wand in her right hand and wore a golden crown on her head. Her face was white, not nearly pale, but white like snow or paper or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. It was a beautiful face in other respects, but proud and cold and stern. The sledge was a fine sight as it came sweeping toward Edmund, with the bells jingling and the dwarf cracking his whip and the snow flying up on each side of it. "Stop," said the lady, and the dwarf pulled the reindeer up so sharp they almost sat down. Then they recovered themselves and stood chomping at their bits and blowing. In the frosty air, the breath coming out of their nostrils looked like smoke. "And what, pray, are you?" said the lady, looking hard at Edmund. My name's Edmund," said Edmund rather awkwardly. He did not like the way she looked at him. The lady frowned. "Is that how you address a queen?" she asked, looking sterner than ever. I beg your pardon, your majesty. I didn't know," said Edmund. "Not know the Queen of Narnia?" she cried. "Ha! You shall know better hereafter. But I repeat, what are you?" "Please, your majesty," said Edmund, I don't know what you mean. I'm at school, at least I was. It's the holidays now." And that's the end of chapter 3.